I'm delighted that Karen Newman is with us this morning. We've been planning this for about a year, I think, and she was shocked I would be that far ahead of something, but I know how schedules get very busy. Karen recently rejoined the management faculty here at Daniels after serving the school as our dean. And she came to Daniels as dean following stints at the Robbins School at the University of Richmond, and then prior to that as associate dean of the McDonough School at Georgetown. PhD and MBA from the University of Chicago, for those of you who are more of a conservative.
It didn't take though.
It took over there. She has been visiting professor at the Czech Management Center, spelled with a Z, Czech Management Center, in the Melbourne School of Business. She's taught in the areas of organizational development, organizational behavior, team building, change management, and those sorts of things. Author of over 40 books, manuscripts, articles, and so on. Has been a consultant to such companies as General Motors and General Electric and Kennedy Institute for Ethics and Marriott Corporation and so on. Serves on several boards here locally, the Junior Achievement Board, the South Metro Denver Chamber of Commerce, Women's Forum of Colorado, and the Metro Denver Economic Development Corporation. And Karen, I'm so happy you're with us. Thank you very much for joining us.
Dan asked me to facilitate a conversation, which I am happy to do, about millennials in the workplace, and particularly about leadership strategies with millennials and how that might relate to broader issues of corporate ethics and social responsibility. By way of background, I did not start my research life studying millennials. Well, they weren't born when I started my research life, so that explains that. When I stopped being the dean here, I went back to the faculty, and through a series of, I don't know, maybe it was just magnetic pull, maybe it was chance and luck, I'm not quite sure, but I ended up studying the boomer generation and what in blazes we're going to do with all of these boomers when we start to get my age. I'm one of the older boomers. There are 78 million of us. You've all heard these statistics. Colorado happens to be one of the boomer capitals of America. We have about a third of our population is in that boomer age group. And so I became interested with the Rose Community Foundation in what do we need to do to change how we deal with healthcare, employment, education, recreation, transportation, you name it, when all of these people start to age. That naturally led, and my interest, of course, is how do we keep people productively engaged in work long past the age of 65? We all know about boomers that we haven't saved enough money, and even those of us who have saved enough money saw it kind of go south in 2008, 2009, also 2000, 2001. So there's and we are living longer, we are healthier, we are pretty energetic, and we're sort of used to getting our way, we boomers. So the question became, how in the world do we keep people productively engaged in work long past the age of 65? A lot of people are burned out at age 60 or so. Companies stop investing in their employees around age 55, sometimes earlier. Everybody's anticipating this glide path to retirement. Average retirement age in the US is held fairly steady around 62 for a while. And now all of a sudden we're starting to see that retirement age go up. We see boomers retiring from their first job and then going to get a so-called encore job or a bridge job or a second job or a hobby job. And in the meantime, corporate policies, practices around talent management and talent development haven't really changed very much. We're not yet at the corporate level thinking about how are we going to engage these folks forever and always, or at least for a much longer time. I read an article recently that only about 25% of large companies in America have put any brain power to thinking about different generations at work, and only 10% have actually planned for the retirement tsunami that will happen sooner or later. We thought it was going to happen a couple of years ago, and then the recession came and people held on to those jobs. But sooner or later, we are going to start to leave those corporations. Well, if you start your restart your research life thinking about boomers, inevitably you have to look at millennials, because that's who we work with. It's a larger generation than the boomer generation. There are about 80 million of them. They are not yet fully in the workforce. They're on their way in. The youngest of them was born in 2000, so they're still in school. And we have anecdotal evidence that these folks are different. Now, how many of you are boomers? Okay. Do you remember when you started work? Didn't your parents' generation say, these younger people, they just don't know what a good day's work is? Didn't you hear that?
Yes.
Yeah, I did too. And that's what we find ourselves now saying about the millennials. They don't like to do a full day's work. We work harder than they do. They only want to work 40 hours a week. Work-life balance is important to them. Huh.
How dare they?
How dare they? Exactly. Jen and I were talking about this earlier. There's not a lot of really good empirical evidence about how different those millennials are from the baby boomers, from Gen X. But everybody in this room can tell a story, right? Everybody in this room can tell a story about how things didn't mesh quite right between the more mature, experienced employees and the younger ones coming in. And so even if we can't point to the definitive study, this is my University of Chicago training, if it's not empirically demonstrated, then it's not real. But even though we can't point to a particular study that says definitively this is exactly how everybody's different, in our guts, we all have a story. We have a lot of anecdotal data. So I'm going to ask you to take a journey with me today, and that is to assume that there are some differences and that we can think intelligently about how we make hay with those differences, that we don't resist them, that we don't get upset by them, but that we work with them, incorporate them into how we manage, and maybe come out better for it in the end. So I am an old college professor, and I have a handout, right? I had to kill a tree. I know. I had to kill. Yeah. Well, I asked Dan if a PowerPoint was expected, and he knew I could just see him going, "Oh my God." He gently and lovingly said, "No, we don't expect a PowerPoint." This is my distillation of a number of sources that delineate some of the observed or rumored differences between and among the generations. This one is based largely on Tamara Erickson's book, Retire, Retirement, but it includes elements of several other people's work. The idea with generational studies is we are who we are now because of where we were when. It's not new. There's a book that was titled something like that, written about 40 years ago. So this idea of differences in the generations is not new. It's just that now that the baby boomers are experiencing it, we're pretending as if it was the first time that it ever happened. But the idea here is that different generations or cohorts will have some characteristic differences on average because of the surroundings of their formative years, because of the circumstances of their formative years, ages maybe 8 to 15 or so. And so if we look at the millennials, one of the defining characteristics of their childhood was either Columbine or 9/11 or both. And that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out as they mature. Those are not very pleasant events. But then as we look at these, you'll notice that most of them are not very pleasant events. The millennials, of course, were raised in the digital age. They are fully technologically capable. They're completely plugged and wired, and they were never not. They don't remember a time when there weren't cell phones, when there wasn't a PC in the house, and so on and so forth. Now, a caveat here. Folks who do this kind of work have been accused of being elitist and it's true. This is really middle and upper middle class characterizations. It's not poor folks, it's not undocumented workers, it's not people from outside this country. So the caveat when we talk about this is that we tend to be talking about folks who were raised in the middle or upper middle class in the United States. So these folks also had, let's see, so we have a lot of boomers and parents of boomers? No. I mean, I'm sorry, parents, oh yeah, no. Parents of millennials or Xers, okay. How many of your kids were on a sports team where everybody got a trophy? Yeah. How many of you were on a sports team where everybody got a trophy? Right. So we as parents have raised children because we want their self-esteem to be strong, because we want them to enjoy sports and activity. We've raised a generation of kids who tend to think that just showing up is going to do it for them. And that may be 80%, but it's not 100%. We also have scheduled our kids more fully than other people have, partly because this is the first time we've had 2 career families throughout the generation, and you kind of have to schedule them when you've got mom and dad doing handoffs, and there's a babysitter here, and there's soccer there, and there's ballet over there. There has to be some organizing going on. So the millennials are, the interesting thing that I find about the millennials is that makes them different from the boomers when we were their age. How many of you remember the expression, don't trust anybody over 30? You remember that? Now I'm really showing my age. You know, I was a child of the 60s, and we went through a lot of social change, and there was a lot of marching in the streets, and not trusting authority was a hallmark, at least of my coming of age. The millennials are exactly the opposite. They love authority. They love their parents. Their parents are often their best friends. My parents? No. I love them, but I would never imagine to and they wouldn't describe me as their best friend, and I wouldn't describe them as my best friend. But millennials often talk about their parents as their best friend. They're on the phone with them at least once a day. They love being mentored. They crave feedback and guidance. To the point, I'll give you a little anecdotal story here. When I was at Georgetown, I taught graduates and undergraduates through the 1980s, late 1980s and early 1990s, and then I became an associate dean. And then I had a sabbatical and wrote a book, and then I think I taught a group of grad students, and then I went off to be a dean at Richmond, and then I came here to be a dean, and then I had another sabbatical, and so I was finally back in the classroom. I had taught undergraduates in 1990, I think, and then I was back in the classroom in about 2009 maybe. So it had been almost 20 years since I'd been in the classroom. At Georgetown, the last time I taught, the students didn't want specific directions. They wanted the general framework, and then they wanted to be left alone to do their work. They wanted to be autonomous, independent, and they didn't want me putting blinders on them and constrictions on them. So, of course, I waltzed into the classroom in 2009, having not taught undergraduates for 20 years, and did the same thing. Well, guess what? Not so good. These millennials, 20 years later, one of my students said to me, "Can you just tell us where to start?" She couldn't, and this was one of the better students, she couldn't figure out how to do an open-ended task without being told, here's where you start. So that's my anecdotal evidence about the difference between Gen X and the millennials. The Gen X generation, that smaller generation that's between the boomers and the millennials, is much more autonomous, independent, doesn't want all that much direction, wants to be creative, and is very happy working. Individuals there are much happier working on their own, where the millennials, I swear they don't know how to learn by themselves. I mean, they love to work together, and they can multitask like crazy. My kids can have well, my kids are grown, but back in the day, they could have the TV on and be doing their homework and having a conversation while having a snack simultaneously. I can't read a book while the TV's on, But they didn't have any trouble doing this at all. So there are some differences in the generations. Of course, for the boomers, the big thing that we all remember is where were you when Kennedy was assassinated? That was kind of a defining negative feature of our lives. But on the positive side, my gosh, we witnessed the end of polio, the end of smallpox. We witnessed the civil rights movement, the women's lib movement. The social change that went on when we were coming of age was phenomenal. We watched schools being built as we were coming along. People, when I came back to Denver, of course, the first question is, where'd you go to high school? You Denver natives would appreciate that. And my answer is, I opened Bradley Elementary School, I opened Thomas Jefferson Junior Senior High School, I opened Poudre High School in Fort Collins, and I graduated from Arapahoe High School with the class that opened Arapahoe High School. I was in the vanguard of the baby boomers, and they were just, as my group came along, it was a brand new school that opened and opened. So the world for us was before us. The world changed in response to us. So the optimism, the sense of possibility, the sense of we can do this, and then also the commitment to the society we have built, because we were pretty participative in that society. We did march in the street and we did change things. We got our way. And so we're pretty committed to that. And we're pretty committed to our way of doing things. We have a pretty strong work ethic. We got over the don't trust anybody over 30 part. And maybe the millennials will start to not trust anybody over 30, I don't know. And then of course the traditionals, who are a little bit older and starting to retire fairly quickly, are folks that can remember World War II and the 1950s prosperity. They tended to be born in the recession, in the Depression, and so it's a very small generation, just like our Gen X. All right, so all of that said, now the handout that I gave you is just some notes. The second page of the handout is actually, an example of a little analysis that I did with an engineering company about their career paths. My interest is in careers. And this is just an example of how you might go back to your organization or have a conversation with your friends about how do our current employment practices fit with the needs of the different generations, and where might we change those employment practices to fit better with the needs of the different generations. This is just an example. I don't want to go into a big long talk about it, but this particular company has a lot of boomers and a lot of Xers and is starting to hire millennials. It doesn't have the capability to do an intranet social networking, and these young people really want that, so they're fussing about that. The company has a reputation as a career company, yet has grown fairly rapidly through acquisitions, and so there are a lot of people who are not career employees in it because of the acquisitions. It turns out the millennials, God love them, want careers more than the Gen Xers. They're a throwback generation. 1980s, Jack Welch came along and downsized General Electric. You all remember what was going on then was downsizing, right-sizing, re-engineering, offshoring, and we went through a period between 1982 and about 1992 of downsizing an awful lot of corporate America and a lot of disruptions in the marketplace. In my field, people talked about the end of the corporate career, that the organizational career was dead, and that you had to be the master of your own career, and you can't expect anything from the company. You have to take care of it yourself. A lot of companies got rid of their training programs, their rotation programs, started hiring people more on a one-off basis, on an as-needed basis, rather than hiring a class and putting them through a program. And the boomers kind of got used to it. Some of us lost our jobs during that. The traditionals kind of got used to it. Some of them lost their jobs. The Xers, that's what they grew up with, and so they are independent and autonomous and don't expect anything from anybody. The millennials, who got a trophy for showing up, think that the company ought to provide some career relevant experience. Where do they get off talking like that? It turns out they may not have a career in one company, but they want a career. And they're very focused on, what have you done for me lately? How is this going to make me more valuable to either this employer or the next employer? Show me the money, not the money. They're not as interested in money, but they're interested in the promotion opportunities. And in this hypothetical company here, they had kind of lost track of their career paths along the way. And so they're experiencing higher turnover than they would like among their millennials. I think half of their voluntary turnover takes place among people who've only been there for 1 year. And so and the reason that folks give is, I don't see the career opportunity, even though the old timers who are there say, oh, there's plenty of career opportunity. So the millennials are actually pushing us in terms of employment. They're pushing us a little bit on career opportunity, which implies training. They're pushing us on life balance. I don't want to give my soul to the company, I want to have a life. They're pushing us on flexibility. They're pushing us on group work versus individual work. They're pushing us on the definition of success and capability and competence. It's not necessarily equated to face time, number of hours worked. They're pushing us on intellectual property. I see nodding back there. Their definition of what's yours and what's mine is different than my definition of that stuff. It's other people's work. We can do this collectively, and it's everybody's. Knowledge is to be shared, not hoarded. Knowledge is to be shared, not valued, not paid for. So we end up then with these wonderful young people with all this energy and who I hope to goodness will help us reinvent the way in which we do work, because I think they've got some good ideas. And yet they've got ideas that are putting them at odds with some of the ways in which we have traditionally managed, that actually present ethical dilemmas as we manage them. The five sort of, not necessarily ethical dilemmas, but opportunities that I identified. Number one, millennials work well with others, but not so well independently. Right? What do we do about that? Do we do anything about that? How do we turn that into an advantage for us? Number two, millennials are ambitious and want to advance, but not necessarily within the same company. You know, why should a company pay for training if the person's going to leave? On the other hand, if you don't pay for training, the person's going to leave. Number three, millennials seek advancement and life balance. Is this possible? What would this look like? How would we define this? Number four, millennials want to do good in the world. How do we monetize that for the firm? How do we turn that into value for the firm? How do we take advantage of that? And number five, millennials don't share the values of boomers who predominate in the workplace and particularly predominate as bosses in the workplace. What do we do about that? So what I've given you here is sort of talking opportunities. Some people, millennials work well with others, but not so well independently. Did you guys talk about that one? Mm-hmm. Can you start the conversation? What do you think about all that? Is that an opportunity or a problem or just a non-issue?
Well, I think it's different in different organizations. Okay. And, you know, because we had a few different thoughts on it, similar but different. Right. And, you know, in my experience, it depends on, sounds like the theme is boomer and millennial, but we're not addressing Gen X in this conversation, where I think we have to go through them to get to the millennials.
They are there, yes.
And I fall into that category, and I agree with the analysis. I mean, and working autonomously, and having that independence. But so these millennials want to be mentored and coached and provided career guidance and work as a team. And this kind of overlaps with another of the questions. But the people who are directly managing them, you know, don't want to do that. But the people who have more of, like, let's say, the financial stakeholder in the organization want to learn how, but they have to get through that other generation, let's say. Okay. And so I think it's an opportunity for not just these two generations we're talking about, but also 3 different generations. And that's hard, because in the organization I was referencing before, is we are sandwiching the leadership and the millennials, and we're trying to create this culture change through these two populations with these Gen Xers, and that's the resistance, because the millennials are working with them day to day,
Yeah.
not the leadership.
Yeah.
And so it comes back to communication and messaging and a lot of different factors.
Okay.
We always talk about being leaders at all levels, and one challenge that we have with our Gen Xers is because of the autonomy and independence, they don't really even want to work with each other. And, and I see that on my own team. So,
Explains a lot.
Well, let me flip it a little bit. They don't want to work with each other. That really is, you raise an interesting dilemma.
well, when you think about, as the millennials, we learn by example. So if their example is very siloed management practices and we don't work together, then what kind of a message are we sending?
Well, they'll leave.
Right.
Because they don't like that.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. What about leadership development? What about employee development? What about the effect that this penchant for teamwork has on your ability to develop talent internally? Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
You know, we talked about that, and that was the question I asked these two experts. And in part, I think it's a matter of looking at a multifaceted way of addressing that. I mentioned logistics real quickly, and that is changing the workspace, how people work together physically, so that you actually do celebrate that fact that we're working together as a team. And then part of that is the reward factor. How much does the reward the team, and how much does it reward that independence? So there's a lot of factors that have to be addressed. I think it's a mentality, though. I think it's accepting the fact that there's enough evidence out there, even though it's not empirical evidence, that millennials do act this way and Gen Xers act that way. And as a good leader, I think it's important that you have a mentality that treats that all the time.
And that you understand that the reward systems are different for each.
Yeah, and build that into the system also. So leadership, leadership development, it complicates that because it makes it much more complex.
Yeah,
Instead of one spreadsheet, you now have 12 spreadsheets that you have to learn from.
yeah.
So it's a complicated conversation.
Is it important? I don't know the answer to this, and I think probably by asking the question, I'm revealing a bias. Is it important that we assess people as individual contributors as well as members of a team? Or should we just be satisfied if the team is doing well, we're going to assume that everybody on the team did their part?
Well,
That's
I think
that's a
that,
dilemma. We talked a little bit about that. I think there's a mentality that if, well, I was part of the team succeeded, why should I be not rewarded in the same manner at review time or at salary review time as, you know, Joe or Susie or whatever, because I was part of their team and we were successful in the team. Well, we all know that even in the team, there are some that lead that team, that exert themselves maybe a little bit more, put a little more energy into it. When you observe those things, you know, where's the fairness issue in terms of how you treat individual A versus individual A in that process? And I think to Bill's point, that's kind of a little bit of a dilemma for us, or from my perspective as a manager, is it's very difficult to have a performance discussion with somebody who's been part of a successful team. But you know and you observe things that aren't.
Yeah. I just wondered the extent to which, though, that's our problem, not theirs.
Well, it is.
To go back to Bob's point about.
But that's hard to communicate to them.
It is.
This isn't about me.
Yeah,
It's
well,
about you.
And it's hard to accept, for me, it's hard to accept
Sure.
personally.
Absolutely.
That I have some assumptions, I guess.
well, I think it's a matter of the metric that you use to assess.
Yeah.
So if I'm assessing the team, I can use, let's just say, financial metrics. If you're assessing me, then how well did I fit in? How well was my mannerism effective or not effective? How well did I satisfy my personal goal of becoming much more engaged in meaningful understanding of the business? So it's what you're measuring, I think, that adds to that attractiveness or not being attractive, to measure both the team and the individual.
Karen?
Yeah, I realize this is somewhat overly generic, and there are obviously individual exceptions, but my experience is you get a lot more buy-in, feedback, and agreement on that team concept with the millennials. My Xers want nothing to do with that. They want to be
I know.
assessed individually. They do not really care what the team did. They mean, I mean, in terms of when it comes to assessment, they want to be assessed for what their contribution was. You know, what so-and-so wasn't pulling the right, I was doing all the work for that, I want the credit for that. Don't give it to the team.
Yeah.
I did my share.
Yeah.
I want to be recognized for what I was doing.
So what does this imply for leadership development in the company? Oh, did I interrupt, John?
No,
Did you want
it's
to-
all right, go ahead.
Well, I mean, like, if we, can we bump it up a level and say, all right, now we're looking at Pinnacle, and you need to grow the next generation of leaders. We're looking at CH2M Hill. You need to grow the next generation of leaders. You're a consultant that works with people who are growing that next generation of leaders. How do we work with these Xers who really like to do it by themselves and the millennials who really like to do it in teams and create a good leadership cadre going forward 15 years from now?
I'll comment on that. I think the best leadership development is giving people the opportunity to lead something and coach them, coach them, coach them. So when we talk about doing the assessment later on, and the X's want this and the millennials want that and they're incompatible, how can we reconcile that? I reject that. That should have been a continuous process. There should have been dialogue all along. That is the feedback. It's the weekly sessions that you have with every team member. Hey, this is, I'm giving you some feedback. What are your issues? Well, I just want to be judged individually. Well, come on, you got to think about this. That's a learning experience that comes not with an annual assessment, but it comes in daily feedback. And so you're saying to the person, we're on this team, but each of us has an opportunity to lead at times. There's a hierarchical leader, but sometimes that leader bites his tongue and somebody else leads. That's the leadership development. Of course, you got to go off to a program, take a course at DU or whatever it may be, but the real leadership development comes in the day-to-day trenches when you're encouraging people to lead something and you're giving them that coaching and feedback. And it's not an annual assessment that's a surprise to the Xer versus the millennial. That's my opinion.
Okay.
Yeah, this is leadership as a verb, not as a noun.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's exactly the point.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I like that. I'll steal that.
Next book.
And I don't think
Get
it's,
your
I don't think it's a
royalties.
choice of, it's not a choice of one way or the other. I think one of the benefits of working for a truly international company, both here and before, is you see the difference in cultures. I mean, when you work with Europeans, it is a much more team-oriented
Absolutely.
environment. And I think the best leaders learn how to take the bits and pieces from each and make it all work together. And again, it's not picking a dictatorial style or picking a team style. It's working with those team players and giving them the team experience and letting the individual contributors know that their individual contribution matters. And I think when you talk about leadership, it's one of the things that I think has happened as we kind of narrow pathways to success in corporate America is you lose that multicultural benefit that you get from leading groups of diverse people. And that's, I think, where we can learn from millennials, because they are more diverse. You know, I talk to my kids, and, you know, when I was growing up, no one talked about the kid who has gay parents. No one talked about the integrated family. No one talked about this is his third dad and things like that. We didn't, but kids today, they're good with that.
Yeah.
They're, I talk about, my son has a learning disability, and he has stuff that he has to have on his desk, that he can chew on and stuff like that. There's other kids that do too, and they're cool with that.
Yeah.
And I think we can learn from that. And that's where, as boomers, as Gen Xers, you've got to take that leadership and put your personal feelings aside and learn from that. A perfect example at CH. We're going to this open office space thing. I've been a lawyer for 19 years now. I've always had an office.
Yeah.
I've had a door that I can close and I can do my work.
This is a shock.
I'm going to the cube. So I'm going back to the cube. And it's a change, but I think it's cool. Because you know what? it's a better workplace. It's more open, it's more collaborative. And I think we learn from the millennials on that, because they love that.
Okay.
And the best leaders learn from that, and it's not a choice.
All right, so if I can try to kind of recap question one, I like leadership as a verb rather than a noun. The idea of appreciating the differences among people, whether it's the Xers versus the boomers versus the millennials, or people who have different backgrounds, different cultures, and work with that, not against it, but benefit from that, not against it. Learn from the differences, and the millennials are, once again, they are a valuable asset because they are very good at this. These differences don't bother them one bit, the way that they bother us.
Let me add one caveat to that, if I may, Karen.
Sure.
We wrote an article that was just in Fast Company about a month or so ago, and it was titled something like, "Is the maverick in your company a genius or a jerk?"
Yes, yes,
And
yes.
we start out by saying, would Tim Cook hire Steve Jobs? And I don't know, because
Yeah.
Steve Jobs was a pretty off the
Handful.
chart kind of person. So whether it's a millennial or an Xer, there are some people that are just mavericks in the organization. And we make a strong argument that the leader needs to coach those people. This is how you fit in. You can't just be flip-flops and whatever. You got to come to the team meetings. You got to participate. But there's a point where the maverick goes over the line. And that's basically where they're muttering, where they're undermining the values and the purpose of the organization. And they need feedback. You got to stop that. But if they don't, that's the time when the maverick becomes toxic. And it doesn't matter whether they're a millennial and, well, that's the way they were raised. Sorry, you're out of here. And if you don't take those people who go from maverick to toxic out of the organization, you're really going to undermine your culture.
Yeah.
Because everybody else is going to say, look at the behavior they're tolerating, and so all your work goes down the tube.
Yeah, and that's actually very demoralizing.
Oh, it is.
When leaders don't take care of performance problems, one way or whatever the source, is really demoralizing.
And it can change the entire culture of the
Oh,
organization.
yeah, oh,
Right.
yeah.
Dan and I want to talk to you about wearing a tie to the next
Yeah.
Oh, God. Forgot my tie last night. I almost called him and said, bring me a tie.
Maybe make one final observation on this, I think this issue of leadership development in organizations is going to have to recognize a trend that's clearly going on and is going to be accelerated by this millennial generation. And it's a concept that I first learned from Bob Van Rack again on the ski lift when he was first noodling some ideas for this book. And that is that leadership is a team sport. And, when I was coming up, leadership was an individual event. And people were trained as individuals to develop their, quote, leadership skills and styles and so on. And it seems to me that these leadership development programs are going to have to deal with teams, groups, and flexible teams.
Yeah, and
Somehow.
I think that encapsulates what I was trying to say earlier, is it is a team sport, not an individual event, and yet when we grew up, it was an individual event.
Right.
And you had to find a way to evaluate people individually, to know who to promote. And I think my thinking has to change, that leadership is a team sport, and that it's not, we have to rethink how we conceptualize leadership. I don't have all the answers, but I think I know.
What are you doing
Be
here?
still my heart. Yeah, why are you here then? Come on. All right, millennials are ambitious and want to advance, but are not loyal to one company. Did anybody discuss this one or have comments on it? Okay, nod away. Go.
It seems like they're gonna leave one way or the other. If you don't invest in them, they'll leave. If you invest in them, there's a good chance they leave. I think it's just reality though, and we talked a little bit about it. I think that you probably, you gotta change your mindset and not be as self-critical when somebody leaves for greener pastures or a new opportunity. I think we all take that very personally if we lose a team member, especially if they're a good team member. I stress to my managers, what's great about our organization is we have people that have a great opportunity to build a career across many lines of business. We have 80 different businesses in our company, and let's not hold them back in terms of their opportunities to move from one business segment to another. And that's hard for managers to accept and to embrace, but we have to do that. When we lose them externally, it's like a dagger, you know. You say, how can they leave?
I've done for you.
Yeah, after the, you know, the amount of money and time we've invested in you, you're leaving. That's just something we kind of have to get over. And as I said, if you're thinking about building a team, and a high performance team, you're going to have, you know, as that core is growing of really talented people, you know, you're going to have some changes. You're going to have some fallout. But
Well,
as
in
long
fact,
as
if-
you're adding to it and moving in the right direction.
If you've done a good job of hiring them, yes,
Yeah.
because you've got great people with great potential.
What's even more interesting is we have what we call boomerangs in our organization, and those are individuals who have left and realize that the pasture is really brown. And they
It's
want
just
to
spray
come
painted.
back.
Happens a lot. Yeah.
And some of them, when they want to come back, we don't want to hire them.
That's right.
I mean, you look at Mayo Clinic, you look at the turnover that they have in the healthcare industry, which is terrible. Their turnover is so much lower. Zappos.com, they've got people with tattoos and earrings who you would think would be here today and gone tomorrow. They've been there for 10 years and they love it. If you create the kind of culture that we're talking about in this room, you're going to mitigate that greatly. You don't have to accept number 2 as a premise. They're going to be gone.
Okay.
People don't leave Mayo Clinic. They don't leave Emphasis in India because they love it there.
Okay. Bill?
No, I agree with that 100%, and I think, you know, those are.
CH2M Hill.
Yeah, CH2M Hill's the same way, but, you know, the culture that we've created. I do think that part of the millennial kind of tendency to leave is part of the information that they're exposed to that we weren't. I think now I get pinged 5 times a week with job opportunities. I mean, all over the, you know, through different LinkedIn's and
Yeah.
all this. And I think, you know, we didn't have that opportunity. You kind of knew, like, a job was there, but you may not know that it was in Boston or all that. So I think that's part of it. But I agree with you 100%. I think if you create the right culture, people will stay regardless of what generation they
And
come
so
from.
would you take it a step further to say that you don't need to recreate organizational careers? You just need to have the right culture and that'll take care of it?
You need to have the right culture, and you need to know how to communicate that culture to the employees. And I think that's, you know, if there's one issue that we haven't talked about that I think would be interesting is the difference in communications between the different generations and how you communicate. You know, and I struggle with that as a manager. My dad talking to me about doing something right was a different way than I talk about my kids.
Yeah.
And I think as managers, when you say to somebody, you know, Bob, I want you to go out and research this and get it to me by Tuesday. You know, I responded to that differently. I think kids now don't know, you know, you need to lay out more
And start
information
here,
for them.
and here are the people you need to talk to.
Yeah, and that's where I think
yeah.
communication is critical, and learning how to communicate across these different groups as an organization. You can have the best culture. You can, as a leader, want to have the best culture and do everything you can, but if you don't communicate it right, it's not gonna work.
I think you also have to make yourself accessible, so that if you're not communicating effectively, people feel comfortable asking for the additional information.
Right, and that you don't criticize them for that later. Because I
Right.
remember as a young lawyer, if you came up to somebody and asked questions about things, boom, that goes into review. Like, you know,
Yeah.
asks
Yeah.
too many questions.
Yeah.
You know,
Or ask too many dumb questions.
Right, you know, and that, you can't do that now.
Gene, did you have a comment?
I was just gonna say, you know, we like to say we manage by culture.
Yeah.
And you have to live that every day. You have to, that's how you manage. And when people come to our organization, say, you know, what's it take to be successful in your organization? And I say, you know, great attention to detail, you gotta play well with others. And that's sort of the culture that we, I think, embody on a regular basis. And when you have the boomerangs that come back, it's generally because of the culture. They miss the culture.
It is.
Okay, so then the solution to this problem, you read about this in economics-based books. They talk about the return on investment and about investing in human capital only to have it walk out the door. And they talk about specific training and general training and all manner of things. But in fact, what I'm hearing here is, forget that. Create the right culture and it'll be a magnet for talent. And then the career path flows from that. The career path will take care of itself. But at the core of this, you have to create the right culture. And then you don't have to worry about, should I invest in this person or not? Because if you've got the right culture, the right people will stay. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes.
One of your colleagues says, culture eats strategy for lunch.
Yeah.
Scott McLaughlin.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's.
And a part of that, I think, is not to have the senior management create the culture, and then this is what we want you to do. It's to, as we have said, give that responsibility to the organization. You are stewards for this culture. This is the culture that we want. We want to be this and that, this and that, and we're going to screw up. You have an irrevocable license to step up and lead and protect that culture. Then that's a trusting thing. It's not us, you do this. This is our culture, and you are authorized to call me the CEO on my screw up, and I'll say, God bless you, thank you. That is such a liberating thing.
Yeah.
Because then the culture belongs to them. It's
Yeah.
not mine, trickle down, it's ours.
As long as it doesn't go in your personnel file.
There's-
Okay,
I just
last.
have one comment
Oh,
on
yeah,
that.
sure.
I think that it's key to know where the organization is in its life cycle
Yeah.
for you to say you can create a culture without investing in this individual. I mean, I think investing in leadership creates culture also. So I think
Sure.
it depends on where the organization is in its lifestyle. If it's a new organization and these individuals are establishing the culture and they are the leaders, that's a different conversation than
Yeah.
one that's, very well established, and you absolutely have to invest in these individuals to create culture as well.
Yep.
And that's a strategy also.
Last question here, it's the life balance question. Did you guys talk about this one? Anybody talk about this one or want to talk about it a little bit? How are we going to allow folks to have all this life balance that they want?
Well, let me posit something real quickly, and let me suggest that maybe life, my personal life, and my work are fungible. That is, I can make my work look like my personal life, so that there's no difference between the two.
Uh-huh.
So when you get to the CEO level, or you get to the senior level, and you think about how your life is organized, your life at that level is organized much more around work than folks who are at the junior level in the organization. What's the possibility of creating more similarities at the junior level so that I show up at work at noon, but I have done 12 hours worth of work between midnight and 8. And the reason I show up at noon is because I'm breastfeeding.
Yeah.
And I have that time that I have to be there to get that done. And there's no question. There would be no question of the CEO if that were the case, as it is at HP right now. And so is there a possibility that we can think about life and work as being the same?
Yeah, okay, not bifurcation.
I don't know.
Bill?
I think the good companies do that well, but are consistent in it. So if you have a person who's abusing the flexibility, you've got to handle that issue as well. But I think the best companies do that. And again, international companies, you're used to that because, I'm on the phone at, 6 in the morning, I'm on the phone at 10 at night. And I may not get into the office until 11 because I've been on a phone call from 5:30 to 8 and I have to get ready after the phone call. So I do believe that, and again, even for lower level people in the organization, you've got to recognize that they have that same issue too, whether it's a personal issue or a work issue. And the good companies, I think, allow that flexibility. But again, monitor it to make sure that people aren't taking advantage of it, because that's where employees get upset, is that people take advantage of it, but they're not really working or they're not addressing a personal issue.
We've come a long way in a couple of years from folks thinking flexible time is you being at Home Depot, not at home.
Right.
So I think it's an evolutionary process.
It is.
But you're right. The more you do it, the more comfortable you are getting it done.
And I think companies that also respond to helping employees balance those issues are good. There's a company we dealt with recently that did a survey of its employees. And one of the things it found, it has a significant number of older employees, was they were dealing with issues with their parents, Medicare Part D, helping them with different issues. So they actually put in a concierge service that allows employees to refer their parents to get someone to help them with these things, and it's been wildly successful.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think it's to Bob's point, they went to the employees and asked them, how can we make you guys happier? And those were some of the things that they came up with.
Yeah, and more productive.
And more productive, absolutely.
So let me pose, we have about 2 minutes, let me pose a dilemma. One of the worries that I read about in the literature from time to time is this melding of personal and professional, personal and work. With technology, I left the house this morning without my cell phone, and I almost turned around to go back to get it. And then I thought, okay, now, come on, your husband's at home, he can answer it for you, it's gonna be okay. And I'm a boomer. But the technology allows us to be connected 24/7 so that you really can work. I mean, I was in Hawaii last week, having a wonderful vacation, but also, I can only text with one hand. I'm not very good at texting. But working as well. But I could do a snippet of work here, I could respond to that email, and without disturbing the vacation or the flow of work back in the office. There are people who say that's not healthy, that we shouldn't be tethered to our jobs, that we really do need to unplug sometimes and have personal space. And I would personally, not for me, I like the idea of blending and trusting people that to behave like CEOs even when they're lower level folk. But I just raise that as a sort of mental health issue that I hear about, that maybe it's not such a good idea to be tethered 24/7 to our jobs.
Well, you created a dichotomy in your conversation. That is, there is work and there is something other than work.
Yeah, yeah.
What if there weren't a dichotomy?
Yeah.
What
Well-
if the value of my texting in Hawaii was equal to the value of my surfing the next moment? So it's one of those questions about how do you deal with, and it's an evolutionary question. It's not a tomorrow morning question.
And what if the value of your texting gave you comfort and peace equal to the value that you get from surfing?
Yeah.
Because you've taken care of something instead of having it just needle at you while you're on vacation.
And yeah, very good, very good, very good. I'm not gonna, that's great. All right, so it sounds like this one is that we really need to evolve or think about blurring the boundaries between work and non-work so that they can become one and they are our life.
But it's not a manipulative
No.
conversation.
No.
It's an evolutionary
An
conversation.
evolutionary conversation.
And who I would give you as the example is Terry, who my understanding of what he's saying this morning is that he thinks in these terms. If I'm dealing with a millennial, what should I be talking about and doing? If I'm dealing with a Gen Xer, what should I, as a leader, be talking about and doing? I think the more we can do that, the more discipline we can put into it, then it becomes less manipulative.
Okay, all right. My takeaway from this is that the millennials are a great resource for us. That they are at the vanguard of new ways of thinking about work and life, and that with few exceptions, they bring value to us by helping us think in new and better ways about employment. Millennials want to do good in the world. How do we translate this into value for the firm? Let's talk about that.
One of the unique things, it was unique to me, my life experience, was with joining Pinnacle and something that they were already doing, that my first thought about it was, wow, this is great, but what is the bottom line value?
Yeah.
How is it contributing?
Yeah.
Didn't take long to immediately see the tremendous value to that. And that is the volunteer efforts that's actually organized to go out in the community, tracking those volunteer hours, encouraging the employees upwards in the 97% range of going out and providing volunteer services, providing 8 hours of paid time off to go.
16.
Is it 6? There I go. 16 hours
He's
of
new.
paid time off.
That's right. We'll give him that.
That was my pro rata for last year. That's phenomenal, and not only being able to provide that meaningful opportunity in the community where they believe that the work allows them to be able to do something, but how it breaks down barriers and gets them out of those siloed walls so that when they come back in the office place, there's an opportunity where they already have a rapport, a relationship that it crosses over various functions that otherwise might not, where they're able to be more collaborative, where they're able to contribute more, where they've got a stronger relationship of trust. They can go and ask people questions, and so when they work on projects, they've already built that relationship so they can be more successful. They're more content in the workplace because of that, because they feel the work's offering them this opportunity to do something else. And all of that allows them to be better employees, lowers turnover if they're happier, and I'm not having to pay the expense of constantly training people and bringing new folks in all the time. And therefore, at the end, I do get that shareholder return. I get the better product. I get the better customer service. I have the happier policyholders.
Great. All right, so there's a positive example.
The other thing I would add to what Terry said is a lot of our volunteerism is done in groups. So an entire team will go and volunteer at Food Bank of the Rockies, which really feeds into that need of the millennials to have a group activity.
Yeah. Okay, all right. So it's not only the need to do good, but also the need to do it with other people.
Right.
Okay.
But I want to add to what Terry said, and I totally agree with that this thing of meaningfulness, they really want more meaningfulness. And my experience and the research that we did for what we wrote is that if an organization rethinks its purpose and puts meaningfulness into it, you tap into that. So it's not just the volunteer hours of 16, which is great, but how do we make our day-to-day work more meaningful? I can remember years ago saying in front of a cafeteria full of people, our mission is to maximize our shareholders' return on invested capital, and the eyes just yeah, that's why we're here, Bob. But Google, to organize and access the world's information, I want to work there. Zappos.com, delivering happiness. They're so empowered with wow customer service that Just Shoes online is delivering happiness. Now their work has meaningfulness. And so you tap into that need and make it help your revenue and your bottom line.
You know, I worked a couple of years, many years ago actually, with a utility in the greater Washington area, and they talked about maximizing shareholder value as simply the air that you breathe. That it's what you have to do in order to survive, but it's not your purpose.
Right.
It's just simply, yeah, sure, of course you have to make money. But they had that one figured out quite a long time ago. What about others of you having experience with this idea of monetizing somehow that need to do meaningful? And by the way, meaningfulness, the need for meaning increases with age. And so as these boomers get older, more and more of them are going to be motivated by doing something meaningful. They're going to start to look more and more like the millennials. I'm not sure that we started out that way, but by tapping into that need to do good, meaningfulness, you're actually addressing not the Xers so much, but you're addressing the two big populations in the workplace.
I can draw a comparison between two companies that I've got good experience with. You know, CH2M Hill being an engineering construction company, there's a lot of cool, meaningful work that the company does. You know, working on a project to bring water to Central Africa is a really cool, meaningful project, which provides a lot of value to the employees in working there. My other company, Teletech, is a customer care outsourcing, business process outsourcing company. And people don't immediately think of that company as having meaningful work. How meaningful is it to answer customer complaints on the phone? But I think Teletech did a really good job of taking what it did and providing opportunities for people to find meaning in doing that. So for a couple of things, we did a Hurricane Katrina relief effort where we had all the different centers answer phone calls for people who were dialing in to contribute to the Katrina issue. Same with Haiti and other things like that. So we specifically looked for those opportunities. The other thing we did was create a wellness culture so that everybody is helping everyone else out in getting more fit. And we had some great success stories that we could share. So again, it's taking those kind of things that interest people and making what seems to be a really bad job just again, answering customer complaints and providing meaning through addressing it through other ways.
Yeah.
And that's, again, so even when you're not a Google or a CH2M Hill, where you have really cool stuff that you can work on, you can still provide that meaning by looking for those opportunities.
Indeed.
Yeah. Others?
I think with Pinnacle, it's the nature of our business, again, customer service orientation, but our goal is to help injured workers. So it's inherent in the business that we have a good mission and that we're helping people. What I think is really critical is to help employees connect the dots between what they do every day. So create that line of sight between, I'm the person who's filing, I don't know, a medical record. So how am I really making a difference? That line of sight is so critical, especially for the millennials, to help them understand what their purpose is and how it contributes to the greater good of, in our case, helping injured workers.
And that's, I think, a critical difference in the communication of what you do in the workplace that millennials try to seek. And I think as boomers, and I'm kind of like this middle of the packet, kind of Gen X boomer guy. But I think that as you get older, you want to find that meaning. You want to find what, how is what I'm doing today relevant? And that's, companies like Pinnacle and like USAA is a perfect example. USAA tells everybody, you don't know when you're dealing with somebody who's in Afghanistan or in Iraq and has a financial issue. And you've got to help that person. And you can find meaning in doing that, in helping people. That's a critical component.
I think one of the obstacles, though, maybe for specific industries and the leadership of, let's say, a function that's not necessarily directly connected to something meaningful like tax or audit or banking or something a little bit more at that level where the millennials are, they're in an entry-level position. Connecting the dots is a little bit more difficult, and then on top of that, you have a schedule of hours that doesn't allow you to take time off to volunteer and see that impact of these opportunities that the organizations provide. And I challenge that to the leaders of the organization to provide that flexibility versus the flexibility tied with the business purpose. And that's a constant challenge with my clients, that they're wanting to provide this meaningfulness to this generation. However, there's a time obstacle, and also just the connection, the like you said, if you're not directed to the specific task of making that connection, they don't see it. And so there's a lot of different obstacles, I think, that get in the way of that, although it's really meaningful.
I think Jennifer raises an excellent point. I mean, that kind of goes to what Carol and William were talking about in terms of, that communication. I remember back in the GTE days before it was Verizon, working in the directories business, and the communication was about, you're doing yellow pages.
Yeah.
But what you're doing is you're empowering small mom and pop organizations, companies, small business, family business that are driving the economy, that are providing the jobs, that are allowing families to succeed. And there's a way about messaging that so that people understand that. So bringing value to that. When you're the entry level, kid working at the banking firm, you're still talking about investments. You're still talking about things that create jobs for people. And there's a way to message and move around that to try to help people feel meaningful. What's important is, what is the focus? I mean, again, is the focus how much is the investors getting back, and that's the only messaging going out, or is the messaging broader than that?
That's an interesting point that Terry raises relative to the honesty of those two generations. How much can you fiddle around with the messaging without actually delivering the goods, essentially, the reality? So you're faced with a timing issue, you're faced with traditional management issues, and you're trying to message around it. I think the millennials and the Gen Xers see it very quickly because they are much faster at doing that. And I think you can only get away with the messaging maybe...
There has to be integrity to the messaging. There has to be a true belief behind that we are truly contributing in this fashion. This is how we're choosing to go about doing it. We need to be successful in how we're doing it, right? But this is what the value is to it. And if the person delivering the message doesn't believe it, if the company doesn't have a culture around believing that, you're right. They're going to see through it pretty quickly, and it's not going to work.
And actually, it has a negative.
Yeah.
Well, as James brought up, I think what you're pointing at, which is both transparency and authenticity.
Yes.
They want you to talk to them about what's going on. Tell me what's happening. Don't tell me that it's happening in behind closed doors. And it takes them about a nanosecond to figure out when you're inauthentic about it. And they look at you and say, "What?"
So if I can kind of wrap up this question, what I'm hearing, tell me if I'm wrong, I'm hearing, number one, that the millennials are bringing value to the company simply by forcing us to think about meaning.
Yes.
So that's a good thing. Number two, insofar as we can design meaning into the work, very cool water projects in Africa, life is easy. If the work itself is meaningful, helping disabled employees, educating students, I mean, there's lots of meaningful work in the world. If you could build it into the work, that's great. And if you can create supportive structures and systems around it, 16 hours, flex time, with authentic, transparent messaging. So it's both the content of the work as well as the enabling structures and systems around it. And how wonderful is this? They want us to focus on meaning and they want us to be transparent and authentic, these millennials.
Well, Karen,
I'd say let's
add
go
that-
hire some.
I'd add on the content side, on the meaningfulness. I think there's a definition of meaningfulness that includes what the Gen Xer or the millennial, a person needs, and that
Yes.
is, I need to have something that I gain more knowledge, I gain more training, I gain more understanding of what I'm doing relative to the big picture. I'm feeling more inclusive, both being included and helping to be inclusive. So meaningfulness necessarily doesn't mean social equity or doesn't mean social responsiveness. It oftentimes means what I need to be able to pursue my career.
Very good point. So even if the work itself, you have a hard time kind of scraping up a meaningfulness about the work itself, if the activities are meaningful to what the person's needs are, you're going to tap into that meaningfulness. Although, and I will say, as people get older, they really are much more thinking about what's been my purpose on earth and have I led a good life, and those big lofty thoughts. So you get to meaning of giving back, doing good as well as doing well. Okay, so I think the answer that I've heard on question number 4 is that the millennials are a valued resource for us because they're forcing us to look more at meaningfulness in work and how we facilitate people getting meaning out of their work. Yeah, Peter. Hi, by the way, we haven't met.
Down the hall. It sounds great, but I think about it. If I were in a leadership position and I was hearing that to make my millennial entry-level employees happy, I need to provide meaning, and then I was hearing from the C-level that our numbers aren't good enough and Wall Street's not going to like this, which pressure am I going to cave to? I'm probably going to look upward, not downward. And so while I think it's correct, I don't know that it solves anything for those people who are in the position to invest in resources.
Very good point, and that's the juxtaposition that shows up all the time. I want to bring your attention to a book called The Good Company by Lori Bassi, who's here in town, and she has lovely empirical evidence that if you take care of your customers, your employees, and your communities, and you are a Fortune 100 firm, you will outperform companies in your industry in pairwise comparisons to companies who do take care of those three with those who don't. You will outperform them by 10 to 15% on the stock market. So this is where you get, we'll have to get Lori Bassi here next to talk about her work and her book. That is such a hard sell, though.
Yeah.
People don't believe it. And yet, there's actually lots of empirical evidence that the companies who provide more meaningful work and have more engaged employees are more profitable. And so the argument might be, am I going to look here or here? And the answer could be, if you look here, you won't have to look there. But of course, this is longer term, that's shorter term, and then we could go on and on and
Let
on
me,
about that.
can I explore that just for a moment and
Sure.
use Bob to explore it? Isn't there a mentality in the C-suite that says, we have numbers to meet, I have a chairman that I have to answer to, let's get it done? And who that let's get it done to is directed to are the folks who are in that today, Gen X world. So no matter how it gets done, it ought to get done. And if it gets done correctly, then the numbers are okay. So when you're looking at caving to the pressure above or caving to the pressure below, I don't know. There's got to be a trust factor somewhere in there that you've got to start introducing these good company qualities into the daily management process.
One of our favorite quotes in the book is from Mayor Cory Booker from Newark. Leaders don't have to accept the options presented them. They find another way. And of course the pressure is there. And that's why the subtitle of our book is Building Excellent, Ethical, and Enduring Organizations. And the research that we did says it's very easy to just say we got to make our numbers. Okay, cut the corner, lie to the customer, exploit the employee, lay off the workforce, whatever. Those are the easy options, okay? But if you have a culture of character that says we're going to be ethical and we're going to be sustainable, both on the environment and with our people here, then you don't have to accept the options presented, lie to the customer or cut the corner. You find another way forward. My absolute experience and my research tells me that the creativity in people, if you have the right culture, will be to find a way to make the numbers and to do it ethically, to have meaning and to do it sustainably. It's a little harder, a little more challenging. You have to take some of the toxic people out, but the creativity in people is so great to do that. If you say we want to be all three of those E's, it can be done. And that's why the correlation of the good company says those who do that outperform, because that's where the commitment comes from.
You know, and Bob, I'd be interested now, it seems to me in growing up in corporations, there are times when that decision has to be made. You know, there are critical points in a company's life cycle where you make that choice.
Right.
To be that company or not be that
Right.
company.
And that sends a huge message.
A huge message. You know, I think about the company that didn't lay people off up in Wisconsin, you know, that kept the people employed.
Yeah.
You can make the choice to lay the people off and keep the numbers going, or you can say, hey, we're gonna have a couple rough years. But I like this workforce. I like what we're doing. You may make some changes in management, but I think those windows open.
Absolutely.
And you can either go that way, or you can shut the window and go the other way.
Look at what Jeff Bezos has done at Amazon. When they went public, he said, we're here for the long term. This is what we're going to do. He got slammed and criticized and all that stuff. Now he's man of the year, CEO of the whatever. God, why isn't everybody doing this? I mean, he's an exemplar of doing that kind of thing.
And the good news is that the millennials will reinforce that, will support it, will push it. That all of a sudden you've got employees who come in and expect it, which when the push comes to shove, if it does, makes it easier to actually keep those people employed, or to make the decision, the decision to treat people better.
I agree exactly with what Bob's saying, and one of the mantras that I try to promote is, I'm not a fan of compromise. I don't think compromise is good. Both sides are giving on something that are generally very important to them, and in the end, you end up with people who are dissatisfied. But if you take the time and the energy instead to look for a synergistic solution, because it's easy to compromise. That's just giving up and punting. Fine, I'll give this up, you give that up, we're done. And then later both people are upset. Take the time and try to work through that more creative opportunity.
Reframe it.
Question 5. Did we have a couple of groups work on question 5? You guys, John and James, what did you guys work on?
Well, we touched on it already, the transparency and authenticity, but actually I would just add the comment that one of the things that I found later in my consulting career was this wanting to be mentored played to what I wanted to do late in my career.
Yes.
One of the things one was not supposed to tell one's consulting partners is that the thing that most excites me is mentoring my younger colleagues, not selling new business.
Yeah.
Not supposed to say that.
Yeah, I know you zipped the lips on that.
But that's what was most satisfying to
Yeah.
me in my last 5 to 10 years of consulting.
Yeah.
And that fit directly into what the millennials were looking for.
Well, let's expand that and talk a little bit about the differences in values between boomers and millennials. Is it a problem or is it an opportunity?
Well, it certainly it was an opportunity for me, I can tell you personally, to work with those folks who aspired to move into the position that I seem to have in consulting.
Okay.
I would question the assertion, Karen, if I may.
Oh, you certainly may.
I have done work with scores of organizations on your personal values and what are our organizational values. And I normally start with a long list, 60 up to 100 different choices, and we work through and sift and synthesize. And I tell you, my experience is incredible. There's about a dozen words that we always come down to. And there's some synonym for integrity. It could be honesty or truthfulness. There's some synonym for excellence. We want to achieve our numbers. There's some synonym for respect or fairness or justice. And it doesn't matter, Karen, whether it's for-profit, non-profit, boomers, Xers, millennials, organizations, and this is just my own anecdotal experience, they come down in those same areas. And so once we go through that collaborative sifting process, as Terry and I were saying, it bridges the gaps. So I don't think that there's a boomer set of values that is antithetical to the millennial set of values. I think there's a lot of commonality if you take the time to explore, and then those bridges are built.
Yeah. And in
So
fact,
I want to challenge this.
no, and I think that's really good. One of the articles that was distributed said exactly the same thing, that on things like fairness, trust, integrity, excellence, there's no difference no difference. So one of the responses maybe to question 5 is, let's focus on the similarities, not the differences. Yeah, Terry?
You know, that's one of the things we focus on. The other, we touched on also, how do you address those differences? You know, how do you respectfully engage in that constructive conversation where you recognize that those differences exist without tearing one another down, and that you can build upon those so that you can learn to appreciate what those differences are as well. Because you can't ignore them, because they are there.
There are some. Yeah, I mean, well, never mind. Yep.
I'd like to go back to a comment that Bob made. I really think that it's important for organizations to understand that personal values and business values mesh. I think some organizations have a tendency to say, here are our company's values, and then we ignore the fact that employees at all levels evaluate organizations' values against their personal values. So there's this blending, and so if you're talking about, for example, integrity, somebody may not demonstrate integrity in their personal life, and that translates into the workplace, and vice versa. They're not siloed. And I think that organizations who recognize that people bring their personal values to work and their personal morals to work, and that organizations need to consider those, are healthier.
I think one of the things that there's similarities between personal values between the generations, but how operational we achieve those, I think, is different.
Okay.
And one of my clients, we've taken about 4,000 people now through a values exercise, and there's 2 different hierarchies: the personal values and then their operational values. And it's exactly what you're talking about, is that we may value the same things in our personal life, but how we achieve them might look different behaviorally. And so that's...
Can you give us an example?
So an example is, so in this organization, the leadership and the millennials, their top value consistently is family. Yet they're putting in, between January and April, 100 hours
Not
a
to
week.
say what kind of a firm it is.
Right. And of course, this is very industry specific too. But the millennials, the way they achieve that is more through flexibility, that's an operational value, and the leadership of the organization achieve it more through, drive, obedience, and discipline. And so there's different ways that you can analyze the gaps. I think that we're a lot alike personally, but operationally we may achieve things differently. And that's where I think between the leadership and, if there is a generational gap amongst how we get to where we want to get, that's what needs to be addressed. Because I think we're all alike. We all want to do good work.
Yeah.
We're not that different here in the room. And that's what my experience has been, is working with the partners and then these associates.
Yeah.
And that they want to work hard, but how they get there is different.
You raise a really good point, and flexibility is a perfect example. Millennials see no problem at all working from midnight until 6 at their home computer and then showing up at work at noon. Because for them, of course, it's getting the work done, not FaceTime. Frankly, older folk are still a little hung up on FaceTime. Let's be honest. There are folks who, if you can't work full-time, I'm not interested, because that means you're not committed. You've heard that? And yet, we made up the 40-hour work week. That's a human invention, and in fact, it's a 20th century invention. We made it up. It's not carved in stone. It did not come down to Moses. And so, maybe what the millennials are doing is helping us redefine how we enact some of these values, like focus on family. And they enact it very differently than the older folks. So it's not a difference in values, it is a difference in behaviors that still need to be addressed.
This idea of the similarity in values that Bob and Carol raises, when we had matrix management beginning way back in the 1980s or whatever it was, my favorite trick when we had to put a team together was to go to the lunchroom and see where people sat and who they sat with. And when it came time to put a matrix team together, I always used the lunchroom theory.
That's a great idea.
I got those guys together as opposed to organizationally putting them together. And it worked a while, and then it fell.
Let me make an observation, taking off on what Jennifer said and some of Bob's comments. And Bob, you and I have talked about this a lot.
Probably on a chairlift.
Yeah, probably. I don't think the issue is whether all 3 or 4 generations would be willing to put the same 6 items on a list. But as you and I have talked about, it's not the values, it's the trade-offs, right? Because you can't satisfy them all. And so I would expect that the conflict becomes an operational conflict when you have to make a decision that's going to prioritize one value substantially over another. That's where you're going to get a conflict.
And
Not
you-
putting them on the list.
Yeah.
And is that a matter of experience? Is the way you get there, is that differential in experience thing? Because I remember when I was in the workplace, I was an idealist about everything, and it's, maybe I've fallen into that old maxim that a cynic is an idealist with experience. But it's
That's so true.
It's true, because, and we kind of talked about that. When you're new into the workforce, and you've come out of college, where you've hung out with, in grad school, guys who got C's were great guys. You know what? Those guys get fired in the workplace today. You can't continually not perform, and that's kind of what we talked about, and still succeed. And I think that there's, if you look at the difference now, not only on experience, but the way corporations have changed, I think this pay for performance culture, which kind of rubs us the wrong way, in a way, where you have to now distinguish between the 5s in your group, because you're gonna rate everybody a 5. Now you gotta go, who's the top 5? Who's the second 5? Who's the third 5?
The new bell curve.
The new bell curve. I think that rubs the wrong way sometimes with the experience coming out of grad school and college. And then also what corporations try to preach in trying to reach out to millennials, which is, hey, let's go do these charitable events together. It's everyone together, all together, everyone's the same, but then you have to begin distinguishing between people when it comes to promotions and career and that. How do you fix that?
Well, here's a theme I'll try and draw out of all this, based on my screw-up experiences over many decades, and I've got a lot of screw-ups, as some of you know, okay? And that is that if you try to do this to fix that, how are we gonna deal with these millennials when their values are this, and what messaging can we do to do that? you're into transactional manipulation, which is going to fail. My experience is that you share the problem. That's what collaboration, that's what values or purpose exercises are all about. You share the problem. Hey, we have some people who want family, but they want flex time, and other people just want to just say, I'm going to work from January to April, and then I'm going to take a long vacation or something like that. How do we solve that? That's what Terry and I were talking about. My experience is that if you share the problem with the group and say, we have this issue, the group will then wrestle with it, and the answer comes out of the dialogue.
Yeah.
Okay? So it's not a matter of figuring out what we are going to do to fix them. It's saying, hey, we are this, we are older, younger, we are left brain, right brain, we are creative, we are engineers that do it this way. How do we work together and accomplish this mission and also do it with meaning and stuff? Share the problem, and the group will find the answer.
Yeah,
That's the thing.
And don't assume that you've got all the answers and they don't. That's the other assumption that has to go with that is, gosh, maybe we've got it wrong, and maybe they have,
As a matter
maybe
of
there's
fact,
something there.
Maybe you have to show your vulnerability to say, hey, I had this assumption and I was wrong. What do you guys think?
Yeah.
And as soon as you do that, they say, well, yeah, you were wrong. We all knew it.
We've done that for
And
years.
here's the answer, boss.
So Karen, you talked about behavior change, and I think one of the mistakes that boomers make is exactly what you're saying. We have all the knowledge, we have all the wisdom, we have all the experience, so you need to do it our way. The behavior change maybe needs to occur with the boomers, not the millennials, and so that we are being more accepting and less resistant to what they're offering.
There's a notion called reverse mentoring. You know about this? Reverse mentoring? Where, yes, you help the young person come along, but the young person helps you with technology or with the cloud or something that you need help with, which is a way of tacitly saying, I value what you know that I don't know, and probably opens the door to a little more sharing of, well, maybe I don't quite have it right. If you're always putting yourself in the position of, I know this and you need to learn this, you're going to reinforce that hierarchy. If on the other hand, it goes this way too, suddenly you end up with a little more of an egalitarian relationship and perhaps more open to hearing some things that you might not otherwise be able to hear. All right, so what I'm hearing from question 5 is, first of all, don't assume differences where they aren't. Number 2, if the differences exist, it's probably operational and not values. And number 3, talk about it. Share the issues. And I guess number 4, I want to go back to Terry. Finding the middle ground is not always the good solution, whether it's value differences or operational differences. But trying to really have a conversation to try to find that synergistic solution, that win-win solution, rather than simply compromising, because then you end up with a camel when you were trying to get a horse, right? All right. This has been a very rich conversation for me. I've been taking notes up here, you might have noticed that. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and thank you, Dan, for the opportunity.
Karen, thank you very much.
Sure.